blocks a vision. The future of public sector using blockchain technology. Mr. Max Kaye, co-founder and chief technology officer of SecureVote and Flux, Australia.
Whenever there has been progress, there have been influential thinkers that denied that it was genuine, that it was desirable, or even that the concept was meaningful. They should have known better. So I'm opening with this quote because it represents one of the two pivotal moments in my career. The first was in 2010 when I discovered Bitcoin, and the second was a few years later when I read this book. Out of the two, Bitcoin was not the more important one. So today, thank you everyone for coming along. So as you've heard, my name is Max Kaye. I'd like to sort of speculate with you a bit about what the next few decades are going to look like. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to go into detail, so it's going to be quite high level. But let's get on with it. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to cover, we'll have a think first about the purpose of democracy, then have a look at what I think is the major problem with democracy, how blockchain interacts with voting sort of 1.1 and 2.0, and what they're going to look like, some of their properties. Then we'll have a think about error correction, which ultimately is a philosophical topic, but is deeply related to governance. And finally, we'll look at how the situation might resolve over the next few decades. I picked the period 20 years in here, but that's a bit arbitrary. It could be longer or shorter or anything in between, as these things are. So what is the fundamental purpose of democracy? Have a think about that over the next few slides. So democracy's purpose, I think we can say a few things about it. So if we do more of it, or if it gets better, then life has to get better in general, at least for those people in the democracy. We should have an obvious answer to why. So if we have, if we come up with some purpose and ask why, and then we want to write a book, it's probably not the right answer. And it's also independent of the form of democracy. It shouldn't matter whether we're talking about direct or representative or any of that. So why would democracy marry blockchain? So it means that it has to, whatever this marriage is, it has to work towards the fundamental purpose. It has to make society more productive, and it has to work in the voters' interest, even if they don't know it yet. It also has to result in better laws. In terms of doing it quickly, then strong and immediate advantages. There has to be no other safe way to implement it. And finally, it has to have low friction, relatively speaking. Obviously, changing anything as big as governance for a nation is not low friction in the typical sense. So, just before we get a bit further, some facts about the universe, a light intermission. So if society never changes, it will be destroyed. This is an undeniable fact. Whether it's destroyed by ourselves or destroyed by something from elsewhere in the universe, we must react to problems. Importantly, no physical law demands human suffering, which means that all human suffering is a soluble problem. It is something that we can fix, provided that we know how. Knowing how is the important part there. Obviously, being able to do it later is then important, but the knowledge is key. And more importantly, we cannot choose the truth, and so we have to boldly face the truths that we don't like and figure out how we can integrate them peacefully. So this is a bit of a thing to talk about over or a thing to think about now and onwards. So would you rather a democracy that biases the will of the people, or a democracy that consistently makes good decisions even if most people disagree with that decision? I think this is an interesting point that cuts through people's, I guess, their intuition about what democracy should be. So I think that the fundamental purpose of democracy is to solve problems. The purpose of doing that is to avoid destruction of society. Everything else, I think, can be drawn back to this. And as we just heard, the alternative to solving problems is death. So, problems with democracy. There's three things we'll cover here. There's some philosophical discussion points, and the optimum strategy in today's democracy, and then what I think is the real evil. In terms of the philosophy, so it's a way to solve problems. It was never designed to bias truth. And I think this is interesting, because if it wasn't designed to bias truth, it wasn't designed to make good decisions, and then so why should we expect it to make good decisions? In terms of the optimum strategy, So I want to play through a scenario with you. Let's say we've got a town of 3 people. It's quite small. We've got Alice, Bob, and Charlie. And Alice wants all cars to be yellow. Bob really doesn't like yellow cars. And Charlie just wants free painting supplies. The issues don't really matter here. But Charlie's thought process does. He thinks, if I make a deal with Alice or Bob, and if they vote for my policy and I vote for theirs, then I can guarantee that my policy passes. Provided I'm not offended by their policy, this presents no issues. So Charlie asks, does anyone want to do this? Alice, having some ideals about democracy, says, no, that's wrong. Bob is pretty pragmatic. He says, sounds good to me. So what happens? Well, I'm sure that you can guess. This happens. And then this happens, and this happens, and on through every issue that this small town of 3 people ever consider. Charlie and Bob have just invented a political party. And Alice is now permanently excluded. An exclusive power rests with Bob and Charlie. So democracy today does not reflect what is right or wrong or good or bad. I think we can change that. Right now, the optimum strategy is to be the biggest group. And I don't think this is a very good goal for what our optimum strategy should be. So what's the problem here? I describe it as something called static majoritarianism. And that means that the majoritarian arrangement that makes the decisions does not change, or changes quite infrequently. What I think a better alternative is a system that does still involve some form of majority, though not necessarily based on people, and that for which the majority changes for each issue, or on a regular basis. So we'll go over voting and blockchain for a bit. It would be remiss of me not to include this. So in terms of the requirements of a voting system and integrating blockchain, these are the sort of criteria that we need. So we need to know that we can submit our vote and be counted. So it must be censorship resistant. We need to know that it was included. And so we need a consensus protocol so that we can agree on which votes are counted and which are not. And finally, we need to know that other votes are not going to change once they've been submitted, which is immutability. I believe that these 3 things simultaneously can only be provided by a blockchain. We can emulate them through traditional organizations like an electoral commission, but we cannot guarantee them. However, with blockchain technology, we can guarantee that those outcomes are reached. Also, in terms of secret ballot, I included this mainly because people think that it's still an unsolved problem, but I am fairly confident it's been solved. I've got 4 options here, one of which I'm not certain about. So we've got homomorphic encryption. Some of you may have heard this. It has some downsides currently, like some of the implementations require every participant to vote if you want the results. Obviously, that presents a slight problem. There's zero-knowledge proofs, which are quite promising, but quite computationally intensive. There's an algorithm that I've created called Copperfield, which is a fully peer-to-peer, trust-no-one vote shuffling algorithm. For anyone familiar, it's based on coin shuffle, which was proposed in 2014 for Bitcoin. And finally, there are ring signatures, which are used in some private financial transactions. However, it's not clear to me yet whether this can actually perform secret ballot. In terms of voting 2.0, which may as well be called democracy 2.0 as well, I think it's going to be quite different to what we experience today. So the first is I think it will be designed to solve problems, or at the very least it will be very good at solving problems. That means that it's a system that deals with issues, or at least deals with on an issue-by-issue basis for who should be solving those problems. It is not designed to represent the people. You'll notice that if you talk to people of different schools of thought, they all have different ideas about what representing the people means. And so I think that it's a red herring, it's a distraction, the idea of representation. It'll also have massive economic, social, and legislative benefits, and we'll get into exactly why that will be in just a moment. And furthermore, the optimum strategy within such a system will be to propose the best policy, not to be the biggest group. So, on to some philosophy and solving problems. So problems are inevitable. This is, in essence, a fact of the universe. There is no way that we can possibly solve a problem forever and never have anything else come up. But problems are also soluble. Now, soluble here just means that we can solve them, but it also speaks to the idea that we are able to, I guess they become part of us and we become part of the problem. It's not that the problem goes away, it's that by the way we arrange the world, the problem is no longer an issue for us. It's also impossible to make progress without mistakes. So if something is making mistakes, that's not a reason to discount it. This is like an inevitability that we have to go through. And through a process of error correction, we can continually improve. And furthermore, problems are solved by explanations. This is the root of how we can understand and know what to change about the world. One of the, I think, issues with our current democratic process is that explanations are often implicit in the policy as opposed to being explicit. And that means that we can often make mistakes, like mashing two explanations together and expecting them to work really well, which is a technique that has not worked anywhere else in the world or in science. So this is a bit of a diagram. Anyone familiar with Karl Popper or David Deutsch's epistemology might be cringing, but I think this gives a pretty good idea. Essentially, if we identify some problem, everything's going hunky-dory, we have many options. And we can't predict exactly which one's going to be the best. We've got a good idea. We can eliminate a lot of the bad ones. And while there is an optimal path forward, it's incredibly hard to ever find one. And that means that eventually the progress that we make and the solution to the problem that we implement will start coming back around, and it will start causing more problems. And so if we implement something and then never do anything to improve it, ultimately it will become just as bad as the problem we were attempting to solve in the first place. What we need to do instead is to initiate a process of error correction. Once we decide on a solution, we can implement that, we can run with it, but eventually that will come to a point where we either should revise the explanation, maybe we should throw it out and start from scratch. But we need to go through this process of error correction and sort of zigzag towards progress. This is how everything works. This is how science works. It's how business works. That process of iteration. And that's how evolution works. It's deeply ingrained in the idea of progress and the idea of how the universe can support life and support human society. So, can we make the error correction in our democratic systems better, faster, more reliable? And yes, I think we have a lot of room for improvement. That's not to say that we're too bad today, by the way. Like, obviously, we're here. It's we've got a lot of tech. We enjoy a very nice life. Things are good, but they can be better, and I think we should strive for them to be better. So, some requirements for better error correction. So we need inclusion. Now, the reason we need inclusion is that if you exclude someone and they have a good idea, you've now diminished your ability to error correct. And so we need a system at least, not where everyone is involved by default, but if someone wants to be involved, they can be. We need explicit explanations. Now, I've included not evidence in parens there because I think that the term evidence-based policy misses the point a little bit. Rather than evidence-based policy, we should be aiming for explanation-based policy. One of the things about evidence and about data is that all data is theory-laden. And so without understanding the explanation of why and how we collected data, we can never fully understand how it works. And that means we have to come back to explanations. Finally, we also need experimentation. Luckily, if we have democracies running in parallel, we can experiment across many jurisdictions. It doesn't have to be within one. But this is something that needs to start happening more and more. And I think that's something that we do quite badly at the moment. So better error correction means that we're going to have more legislative accountability, both in terms of, I guess, the risk of proposing legislation, but also that we can take accountability to improve our own legislation. We're going to see a far more dynamic democracy, a democracy where the people making choices or influencing particular policy changes day by day. And we're also going to experience more economic growth than we could currently have under this sort of system. The reason being is that while, if an economy is playing catch-up, the solutions are already mostly known, so it's quite easy to have high economic growth. But once you're at the forefront like we are, we have to solve problems to keep pushing that forward. And if we increase our rate of error correction, then we can solve more of those problems, we can try more things, and once solutions are found, we can implement them more quickly, even if we didn't come up with them. So, is this a threat to democracy? I put democracy in quotes here because it's obviously not a threat on the whole, but it's definitely a threat to some systems. And ultimately, it's going to depend on how we react to these sorts of improvements. By the way, for anyone who does work in government, I don't think your jobs are going to go away. Just want to preface that as we go through the next few slides. So, in terms of rejecting better democratic systems, So rejection is not going to end well. Rejection of better democratic systems involves suppressing criticism, suppressing new ideas, things like that. There is a term called the precautionary principle, which is roughly summarized as better the devil we know than the devil we don't. And that is possibly one of the most dangerous attitudes that has ever existed in a free society. So suppressing solution leads to things like Easter Island. The question is not why did the people of Easter Island die out? The better question is why didn't they leave? And they didn't leave because their idea of how to solve their problem of things like deforestation was to cut down more trees and make more statues. And we should remember that if we do more of the same when we encounter problems, there is no salvation in that path. So their reaction, yeah, cut down more trees, make more statues. So in terms of the new types, though, if such a 2.0 system is possible, it means a few things. So fundamentally, it means we're going to have to change governmental structures. We can't rely on what we've got already, but that doesn't mean that things are necessarily going to go away. I think it'll mean that we have a massively increased meaningful level of participation. It's worth pointing out here that just increasing participation does not cause, this sort of improvement. The participation has to be done in the style and with the explanation for why it will succeed and why this system is going to be better. It means that the role of leaders are going to become far more important, and we're going to see, I think, many more of them. It also means the role of governors, which by here I mean rulers particularly, is going to become much less important. So what does the future look like? So I think good democratic systems will have a massive advantage over the old ones. Particularly, there's going to be a strong comparative advantage. And so these new democratic systems will help uplift the old systems as well, but the main benefits are going to be for those who adopt it. And it's going to become untenable to avoid adoption in a free society. So, some predictions. Representative democracy will be terminal within 20-ish years. Now, obviously, this could be a lot longer, it could be less long, all kinds of things like that. This is, of course, it's the most extreme speculation I can come up with. I wasn't going to, get up here and be all vanilla and things. We're also going to see an enlightenment, essentially, I think, in terms of the sort of progress that we'll see within democratic systems and participation, ideas, policies, and what to do, experiments, etc. Monocomies between democracies and all other systems. That's just a fancy word for dual. But I think it also implies, to the death. We're going to see, not every society that goes through this transition period is going to pick the right side. I think that the idea, autocratic systems which rely on centralized control are going to have a very hard time in responding against a new sort of democracy that is better at knowledge creation and error correction. So what about blockchains? I haven't mentioned them too much. Well, everything that I've talked about with governance here, I think applies to blockchains as well. Blockchains are very bad at problem solvings. I realized this during the Bitcoin block size debate, which went on, I think, a little too long at 2.5 years. It's also, basically every blockchain that's out there right now is autocratic. In the Bitcoin block size debate, for example, you could be on Team Core or Team Cash, but there weren't any other options there. You had to pick one. No blockchain in existence or planned that I know of has good epistemic principles. None of them are founded from first principles. And like democracy, they're going to fade if they don't change. Bitcoin's been able to survive so far, but if it doesn't improve its ability to solve problems, then I am not confident that it will continue that way. And if it goes against their foundations, which many of them have an issue in this regard, some of them do state philosophic principles that are not exactly aligned with this sort of thing. Some are better than worse. But to change their foundations, I think, will be very, very difficult. So the test for both democracy and blockchain technology in the future is going to be how quickly can they adapt while avoiding all those bad ideas that we like. And I think that's actually one of the main problems, is that we like things. We choose some of the political ideologies or policies because we like them, not because they're necessarily the best or that we're convinced they're the best. So to leave you finally, basically this is, I think, the message, is that we're going to have a chance to avoid making the mistakes we made in the past. And it's going to be important that we do that. Now, that doesn't mean we should rush into things. It doesn't mean that that we have to go with the first option, or that I'm even right in terms of what I think that's going to be. But when we do have that opportunity, I think it's very important that we seriously consider things and seriously consider that maybe we're mistaken in our opinions. So in terms of links and stuff, we're about to finish up. So the beginning of infinity, that is, if there is anything that I would recommend you take out of this talk, it is that book. I think it is the most profound book ever written, and possibly the most important book published to date in the history of humanity. Feel free to disagree with me about that, but obviously I feel quite strong. And also, if you're interested in what a democratic system like this would look like, then please take a look at Flux. We've got some resources there. That's one option, though there are others. Thank you very much.